Roman legionary, the image of unyielding discipline, shining armor, and precise formation is in our imagination. A warrior who brings the light of civilization to the tip of his sword. But what if we put aside this polished image of centuries and look into his hands? What tools were actually used to create the greatest empire in history? Were they just effective weapons, or were they designed with cold, calculated cruelty, aimed not just at killing, but at intimidation, at causing maximum damage, at breaking the enemy's spirit? We will talk not about armor that protected, but about weapons that crippled, of blades designed to inflict terrible internal wounds, of darts that could not be pulled from shield or body, of throwing machines that sowed panic and death at a distance, and of those invisible but no less cruel tools that turned ordinary men into ruthless machines for conquest. This is the story of how engineering and military tactics came together to create an arsenal that has been unrivaled for centuries. Forget noble duels. We're in for the mud, blood, and cold metal of battlefields from Britain to Parthia. Are you ready to learn why a Roman short sword was more fearsome than a long barbarian blade? How could a single throwing spear disarm an entire enemy unit? And what was the most fearsome weapon of the Romans? Even though it could not even be held in their hands, stay tuned to the end to see the 10 most brutal weapons in the Roman soldier's arsenal. This is not just a story about weapons, it's a story about the psychology of war, how cold calculation and ruthless efficiency became the foundation of the Roman Empire. The gladius is undoubtedly the most recognizable symbol of the Roman legionary, his faithful companion, and his main argument in close combat. But don't let its relatively small size, usually around 50 to 60 centimeters, mislead you. This short sword was one of the most brutal and effective edged weapons of its time, and its design was perfected for one main purpose: to deliver swift, accurate, and deadly stabbing blows. Unlike the long swords of the barbarians, designed for chopping blows in the open, the gladius was designed for fighting in tight formation, wall to wall. When the legionaries converged with the enemy, covered by huge scutum shields, they had little room to swing. And here the gladius showed its terrifying efficiency. The legionary made a short, quick lunge from behind his shield, aiming at places unprotected by armor: the belly, groin, throat, armpits of the enemy. The broad leaf-shaped blade with a long point was ideally suited to inflict deep, penetrating wounds. It easily passed between the ribs, ripped through the abdomen, causing massive internal bleeding and organ damage. Such a wound, unlike a cut, was almost always fatal in the conditions of ancient medicine. The enemy who received a blow with a gladius often died not immediately, but in agony, which had a demoralizing effect on his comrades. The Roman historian Titus Livius described with horror how the Macedonians, when first confronted with the consequences of the use of the gladius, were shocked by the sight of terrible wounds, severed limbs, and spilled entrails. The cruelty of the gladius lay in its intimacy. It was a weapon for killing at close range, when you see your enemy's eyes, feel his breath. A legionnaire had to have not only the strength, but also the coolness to deliver those short, deadly jabs over and over again in the bloody junkyard of battle. The whole system of training of the Roman soldier was aimed at turning him into a ruthless and efficient killer, and the gladius was the ideal tool for this purpose. But before a legionary could use his deadly sword, the enemy had to be disarmed and his ranks disorganized. And for this, the Romans had other, no less insidious and cruel weapons. If the gladius was the legionary's last argument, the pilum was the first. This heavy-throwing spear was not just a weapon for striking enemy troops. Its design was an ingenious and brutal engineering solution aimed at disarming and demoralizing the enemy before hand-to-hand combat even began. The pilum was a dart about 2 meters long, consisting of a wooden shaft and a long, thin metal tip. The main secret of the pilum lay in its tip. It was made of 2 parts: a sharp, hardened tip and a long rod of soft, unhardened iron. Before the battle, legionaries threw their pilums into the enemy formation from a distance of 15-30 meters. When the pilum hit the enemy shield, the following happened. The sharp tip easily penetrated the wood, and the long, soft rod, thanks to the weight of the entire spear, bent under its own weight. As a result, it was almost impossible to pull such a pylon out of the shield on the battlefield. The enemy warrior was faced with a terrible choice, either to drop his heavy, useless shield, to which the 2-meter lever was now dangling, and remain unprotected before the attacking legionnaires, or to try to fight, dragging this bulky structure behind him. Both options were bad. Thus, a single volley of pylons could instantly turn a closed wall of enemy shields into a chaotic, defenseless mob. The cruelty of the pylon also manifested itself if it hit the body rather than the shield. The long, thin tip inflicted a deep, penetrating wound, and the curved shaft made retrieving the spear extremely painful and traumatic. A wound was often fatal, and if not, the warrior was out of action for a long time. The psychological effect of seeing comrades nailed to their shields or writhing on the ground with spears sticking out of their bodies was enormous. Each legionary usually carried 2 pylons, one heavier and one lighter. They were used at the very beginning of an attack to wreak havoc and thin the ranks of the enemy, after which the gladiuses were used. This tactic was incredibly effective and became one of the hallmarks of the Roman army. The pylon was not just a weapon, but a tool for cracking enemy defenses, brutal and pragmatic, like all Roman military art. But what if the enemy still withstood this deadly rain and rushed to the attack? Here something more than just weapons came to the fore, the very wall the Romans were creating. At first glance, the scutum is just a means of defense, a large rectangular or oval shield that covered the legionary from enemy blows. But in the hands of a Roman soldier, this piece of wood, covered with leather and reinforced with metal, turned into a universal and extremely brutal weapon, both defensive and offensive. The scutum was more than just a shield. It was a mobile wall, a battering ram and a brass knuckle at the same time. Its large size, about 1.2 meters high, and curved shape allowed a legionary to safely hide behind it. When the shields were pulled together, soldiers could form the famous turtle, testudo, a formation virtually impenetrable to arrows and darts, which terrified the enemy. It was a powerful psychological weapon, but the ferocity of the scutum was evident in close combat. The legionary didn't just passively defend himself, he actively used his shield to attack. The lower edge of the scutum could be used to forcefully strike the opponent's legs to knock him down or break his shin. The upper edge was used to strike at the face and throat. But the most terrible element was the umbon, a large metal protrusion in the center of the shield, usually hemispherical or conical in shape. The umbon served not only to protect the hand that held the shield, but was also a real knuckle. A powerful direct blow with an umbone to the face or chest of an opponent could stun, break the nose, jaw, ribs, knock him off balance, and open him up for a deadly jab with a gladius. Roman tactics often consisted of just that: a thrust with the shield, a blow with the umbone, a lunge with the sword, a simple but incredibly effective and brutal combination. Thus, a legionary covered by a scutum became a kind of human tank. He could press on the enemy's formation, cramp it, strike, while remaining in relative safety. For a barbarian armed with a long sword or a spear, a collision with such a wall of shields, which suddenly came to life and began to hit, was a nightmare. Scutum broke not only the enemy spears, but also the fighting spirit. However, the Romans knew how to fight not only in a tight formation. In their arsenal were other, more insidious means, designed to stop the enemy on the approach, turning the ground under his feet into a minefield. Roman military thought was characterized not only by strength and discipline, but also by cunning. One of the most brutal yet simple examples of this approach were the caltrops, or tribulus, small but devilishly effective devices designed to create hidden traps on the battlefield. It was a weapon that didn't need to be thrown or held. It simply waited for its victim, turning the ground into a deadly trap. The caltrop was a small metal device with 4 sharp spikes, designed so that no matter how it was thrown to the ground, one spike would always face vertically upwards. The Romans mass-produced these unpretentious but terrible articles and generously scattered them on the enemy's intended passive attack, especially on the flanks where cavalry strikes were expected, or in front of fortifications during a siege. The cruelty of the caltrops lay in their indiscriminate and torturous action. They were a real nightmare for cavalry. A horse that stepped on a sharp spike received a severe hoof injury, fell, breaking its legs, and incapacitated not only itself but also its rider, creating chaos in the attacking ranks. One well-dispersed bag of caltrops could stop an entire mounted attack, turning it into a bloody dump of wounded men and animals. For infantry, they were no less dangerous. In the heat of battle, in grass or mud, these little spikes were almost invisible. A soldier who stepped on a caltrop received a deep puncture wound to the foot. Even if the spike did not pierce the thick sole of the sandal, caliga, it could become lodged in it, causing pain and impeding movement. In unsanitary conditions, any such wound could easily become infected, leading to gangrene and death. Caltrops were particularly effective against lightly clothed or barefooted warriors of barbarian tribes. The Romans used this insidious weapon during sieges, scattering it at the foot of walls to make the assault more difficult, enduring retreat to delay the pursuing enemy. Julius Caesar, in his Notes on the Gallic War, describes the use of such traps. It was a silent, passive, but extremely cruel weapon, causing pain, suffering, and chaos rather than instant death. But what if the enemy managed to overcome all these traps and come within striking distance of a last desperate throw? In that case, the legionnaire of the late empire had one more deadly surprise. In the arsenal of the late Roman Empire, when warfare tactics began to change, a new, insidious, and extremely cruel throwing weapon appeared. The plumbata, also known as martio barbulus, which can be translated as Mars thorn. It was a short, lead-heavy dart that legionnaires carried on the inside of their shield and threw at the enemy just before hand-to-hand combat. The plumbata was a short wooden shaft, about 30-60 centimeter, with plumage at one end and a sharp metal tip at the other. The main feature was a lead weight attached to the front of the shaft, which gave the dart considerable weight and penetrating power, despite its small size. A legionary could carry several of these darts, usually up to 5, and throw them one after another with quick, sharp movements. The cruelty of the plumbata lay in its surprise and effectiveness at short range. When the enemy, who had already overcome the zone of fire with pylons, rushed in for a final attack, the Romans met him with a rain of these deadly darts. Light and compact, they flew at tremendous speed and, thanks to the lead weighting, had enough energy to pierce leather or even chainmail armor. A dart like this would cause a severe wound if it hit the body. The plumage stabilized the flight, ensuring accuracy, and the sharp tip easily entered the flesh. For the enemy, who had not expected such a greeting at the last stage of rapprochement, the plumbat volley was a real shock. This weapon sowed panic, thinned the attacking ranks, and gave the legionaries a decisive advantage in the first, most important seconds of hand-to-hand combat. The historian Vegetius, describing this weapon, noted that soldiers armed with plumbatas served as a kind of light infantry capable of inflicting damage before the swords came into action. It was a simple-to-make, cheap but extremely effective weapon, perfectly suited to the defensive tactics of the late empire. The plumbata is a prime example of how Roman military thought was constantly adapting, creating new, ever more sophisticated and brutal ways of destroying the enemy. However, the real power of Rome was not only manifested in the individual infantrymen's weapons, but also in their ability to wreak havoc over vast distances, making sieges a living hell for the defenders. In the arsenal of every Roman legionary, in addition to the gladius and the pilum, there was a third, no less important element, the pugio dagger. At first glance, it was just a last-chance weapon, a spare blade in case the main sword was lost or broken in battle. However, the function of the pugio was much broader, and its brutality was manifested not in large-scale battles, but in the more intimate and darker aspects of war and peace. The pugio was a broad, double-edged dagger with a leaf-shaped blade 15 to 30 centimeters long. This shape was ideal for delivering powerful stabbing blows that could pierce leather armor or slip between plates. In close-quarters combat, when there was no room to use a sword, the short and maneuverable pugio could save the life of its wielder. It could be used to deliver a swift blow to the neck, ribs, or joints of an enemy. But the main cruelty of pugio was manifested outside the main phase of the battle. It was with this dagger that legionaries often finished off wounded enemies lying on the battlefield. This was not a sadistic act. but a severe military necessity. A wounded enemy could still be dangerous or could recover and get back into the ranks. A short, merciful, or merciless, depending on one's point of view, Pujo's strike ended suffering and eliminated a potential threat. Furthermore, the Pujo was not only a soldier's attribute, but also an officer's attribute and a weapon carried in everyday life. It was used for various household needs, but it could also become a murder weapon in a drunken quarrel, during a riot, or when carrying out secret orders. The broad blade of the Pujo left terrible, poorly healing wounds. According to one version, it was this dagger that killed Julius Caesar. The brutality of Pujo is the brutality of up-close, personal violence. It was a weapon not for glory on the battlefield, but for the dirty work that also had to be done. It was a symbol that war does not end after the victory cry. It continues in the groans of the wounded, in the silent massacres, in the need to be ready to be stabbed in the back, even in one's own camp. The Pujo reminded every legionary that the world in which he lived was harsh and did not forgive weakness. But if the Pujo was an instrument of individual terror, Rome also had the means for mass terror, capable of crushing not individuals, but entire walls and armies. The Roman war machine was strong not only for its legionaries, but also for its engineering. And one of the most formidable creations of this engineering thought was the ballista, a huge throwing machine, working on the principle of a crossbow, but possessing monstrous power and amazing accuracy for its time. It was a true mechanical sharpshooter of antiquity, sowing death and destruction at a great distance. The ballista worked by the energy of twisted bundles of tendons, hair, or ropes, which were driven by two levers. It could throw both huge iron-tipped arrows, bolts, and stone balls. Depending on its size, a ballista could hit targets up to several hundred meters away. Smaller ballistae, scorpions or caraballisti, mounted on wagons, were used for targeting individual enemy soldiers, while larger siege ballistae could penetrate wooden fortifications and even damage stone walls. The cruelty of the ballista lay in its impersonal but inescapable destructive power. For an enemy soldier, standing on the wall of a besieged city or in a tight formation on the battlefield, there was nothing more terrifying than the whistle of a flying bolt that could pierce through several men or shred a shield and armor. Death by ballista was instantaneous and horrific. The Romans skillfully used ballistae both in field battles and sieges. A battery of several dozen ballistae could conduct a constant, exhausting fire, preventing the enemy from raising his head, covering the actions of assault troops and sappers. It was a weapon of psychological pressure, demonstrating the technical superiority and inevitability of the Roman offensive. Julius Caesar used ballistae extensively during the Gallic War and at the Siege of Alesia. The accuracy of some ballistae was such that they were used to kill enemy commanders or siege vehicle operators. Imagine the horror of a commander realizing that an invisible and ruthless mechanical killer was aiming at him from 300-400 meters away. It undermined morale and deprived the commanders of the will to resist. The ballista was the epitome of the Romans' cold, calculated, and technological approach to warfare. But while the ballista was an instrument of pinpoint terror, there was another tool in the Roman arsenal designed for total destruction and mounted fire. If the ballista was the ancient world sniper rifle, the onager was its heavy howitzer. This powerful siege machine, whose name translates as wild donkey because of the strong recoil resembling kicking, was designed not for target shooting, but for throwing heavy projectiles at a high trajectory. Its target was not individual soldiers, but walls, roofs of buildings, and concentrations of enemy troops. The onager was a weapon of total destruction and psychological terror. The onager was a massive wooden frame with a single lever attached to it, driven by a powerful bundle of twisted tendons or ropes. At the end of the lever was a slingshot or spoon in which the projectile was placed. When released, the lever hit the limiting bar with great force, and the projectile flew parabolically towards the enemy. The onager could throw stone balls weighing up to 50-80 kilograms at a distance of several hundred meters. The cruelty of the onager lay in its indiscriminate action. The huge stone kernel falling from the sky broke through the roofs of houses, burying their inhabitants under the debris, crushed battle orders, leaving a bloody mess in the place of a dense formation, smashed siege towers, and enemy battering rams. It was almost impossible to defend against such a blow. The sound of a flying cannonball and the rumble of its fall terrified the besieged, undermining their will to resist. But the Romans were not limited to stones. The onagra's slingshot could also be used for other, even more cruel gifts. For example, large clay pots filled with a flammable mixture, Greek fire, that would break when dropped, causing fires in the besieged city. Or, at the height of psychological warfare, the severed heads of enemy ambassadors or prisoners, as well as the corpses of people and animals that had died of disease, to cause an epidemic in the enemy camp. The use of onagers during sieges turned them into hell. Constant bombardment, destruction, fires, the threat of epidemics. All these things exhausted the defenders, deprived them of sleep and hope. The onager was not just a weapon, it was an instrument of terror designed to break the spirit of the besieged and force them to surrender. It was a crude but extremely effective demonstration of Roman military power and ruthlessness. But the brutality of the Roman army was manifested not only in the power of its machines, but also in its very structure, in the system that turned men into perfect soldiers. By the late Empire, the classical legionary with his gladius and scutum began to give way to a new type of warrior, and with it the weapons changed. The short stabbing gladius was replaced by the long slashing sword, the spatha. It was originally the weapon of the Roman cavalry, but gradually infantrymen began to use it as well. This change in weaponry reflected a change in warfare tactics and brought with it a new type of brutality on the battlefield. The spatha was much longer than the gladius. The length of the blade could reach 70-100 semikilometer and had a more pronounced chopping orientation, although it retained the ability to deliver stabbing blows. Changing tactics, looser battle orders, the increased role of cavalry in clashes with barbarian peoples who favored cutting weapons made the spatha more relevant than the gladius, designed for combat in tight formation. The cruelty of the spatha lay in the nature of the wounds it inflicted. While the gladius left relatively small but deep puncture wounds, the spatha inflicted terrible chopping and slashing injuries. A powerful spatha strike could sever a limb, shatter a helmet and skull, and leave deep bleeding wounds on the body. Spatha combat was more bloody, chaotic, and visually horrifying than gladius fencing. The transition to spatha also meant a change in fighting technique. Instead of short lunges from behind the shield, the legionary of the late Empire had to master the techniques of chopping, dodging, and parrying. Combat became more individualized and less dependent on tight formation. This required more mobility and skill, but also exposed the soldier to greater danger. The spatha became a symbol of a new era, an era of constant warfare on the frontiers, barbarian invasions, and the transformation of the Roman army. It was a weapon adapted to the new realities, more versatile, but also more barbaric in nature. It no longer had the laconic, utilitarian brutality of the gladius. It had a fury and scope that reflected the chaos and brutality of the time. But perhaps Rome's most important and most brutal weapon was not any particular kind of blade or machine, but something far more fundamental and all-encompassing. When talking about the brutality of Roman weaponry, one cannot overlook the two most important, most powerful, and perhaps most ruthless instruments that ensured Rome's dominance for centuries. It was not swords or catapults, but two abstract but pervasive concepts: iron discipline and unrivaled military engineering. It was these that transformed the Roman army from a mere collection of armed men into a single crushing machine of war. Roman discipline was legendary and was based on a combination of rewards and extremely cruel punishments. For cowardice in battle, losing a banner, or disobeying an order, soldiers faced the death penalty. The most famous and horrifying punishment was decimation, the execution of every 10th soldier in the offending unit by lot. Imagine the horror of legionaries forced to stone or cane their comrades with whom they had shared a tent and a meal yesterday. The fear of such punishment was greater than the fear of the enemy and made them fight with desperate courage. This brutal system created soldiers who were ready to obey any order without complaint, to go to certain death, to build fortifications in a hail of arrows. Discipline made it possible to carry out complex tactical maneuvers, to maintain formation under the onslaught of the enemy, to act as a single organism. It was this organization and predictability of action that made the legions virtually invincible in a clash with the more chaotic barbarian armies. Military engineering was the second component of this machine. The Romans knew not only how to fight, but also how to build. In a matter of days, they could erect a fortified camp, build a bridge across a wide river, lay roads in impassable forests, and create the most complex siege structures: towers, battering rams, and ramparts. An army that comes with its own fortress, which is able to change the landscape and overcome any obstacles, inspired the enemy with a sense of hopelessness. Siege by the Romans meant not just a battle, but a methodical, systematic strangulation. The combination of these two factors, disciplined soldiers and advanced engineering, was Rome's most brutal weapon. It allowed total warfare, aimed not just at winning a battle, but at completely subjugating and destroying the enemy's will to resist. The Roman army carried not only death, but order, its own, the Roman order, established by iron, stone, and unquestioning obedience. It was the weapon that created the empire. The arsenal of the Roman soldier is not just a collection of deadly tools, but an entire philosophy of warfare embodied in metal and wood. Every weapon, from the short gladius to the giant onager, was the result of cold, pragmatic calculation aimed at maximizing efficiency. In this efficiency was their main cruelty, not in sadism, but in a utilitarian approach to the destruction of the enemy, in which there was no room for sentiment or chivalry. Gladius, pilum, scutum, caltropus, ballistae, all these were links in the same chain, elements of a system that allowed the Roman army to dominate the battlefield for centuries. But the most fearsome weapon, as we have seen, was the system itself. Iron discipline, advanced engineering, and the ability to turn thousands of individual men into a single, ruthless mechanism that crushed everything in its path. By studying these weapons, we better understand not only how the Romans fought, but also how they thought, how they built their empire. Their arsenal reflected the essence of their civilization: order, pragmatism, ruthlessness to enemies, and a belief in their own superiority. It was a brutal era, and the weapons were to match it. If you were interested in this dive into the harsh world of Roman military art, and you want to know more about how warriors of the past fought, lived, and died, give us a like and subscribe to our channel. Many more stories about the most formidable armies and deadliest technologies in the history of mankind await you.